Well, thanks everyone. It's great to be here and certainly a warm, sunny welcome to the Huon Valley. And if this is your first time here, it's a beautiful place to be and a wonderful place to be doing research actually. We are very privileged here in Tassie, southern Tassie, to be working with some of the best growers in the country. Apple growers, cherry growers and wine grape growers, and it's just a quick little drive to through the Huon Valley, and you can just see the investment that growers are making in horticulture, particularly tree crop horticulture, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Talking about some of the work we've done in wine grapes and also tree crop horticulture. And we are, I guess this, the science that we're doing is really, I guess, pitched at the growers who are producing high volumes of fruit. So not necessarily the smaller home producers, but the science that we do is directly relevant to those of you who have smaller plots of land or are thinking about some of this stuff for your own home gardens even. So yeah, it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm actually representing Pippa French, who's my PhD student. She wasn't able to make it and to talk about her body of work, and I'll talk to you about her body of work, and also some work that we're doing for the apple industry, which is funded by levy payers. And I want to talk about that because that has an influence on how we do the work that we do. But first of all, I get to talk to you about Pippa French's work, and it's a real privilege to be up here talking about the fabulous work that she's done. I'm really proud of her as a student and how far she's come and what she's doing. She's based in Launceston. She is she's doing a PhD. She's had twins during her PhD process, and she's absolutely smashed it out of the park, and both in her science and also her parenting as well. So it's beautiful to be up here and talking about some of the science that she's done, and it's coming towards the end of her PhD candidature as well. So what she's looking at is, I guess, undervine cover crops or undervine living mulches. And I'm going to use the word cover crop and living mulches I guess simultaneously really, because they are essentially the same thing. But from a whole of, I guess, orchard context or whole of vineyard context, I want to use these terms as a soil amendment or a soil improvement. And we're recognising, just as the guys were talking about earlier, that we're in an ecosystem. We're in I guess what we're wanting to be in a biodiverse ecosystem. And I guess that's the point of what we're talking about today, and how to grow that biodiversity and how to use that biodiversity from a real functional perspective to be producing high quality fruit. And so I think there's two aspects to the work that we're doing. One is obviously that we're trying to create long-term sustainable soils that are going to keep our vineyards profitable, keep our vineyards productive, or our orchards productive. But we also need to produce soils that can grow really good fruit, so that these guys who are in business can stay in business. And that's the challenge, because good fruit means good wine, and good fruit when it comes to apples and cherries means I guess export quality. And so in Tassie we are really fortunate that we're in an area that's free of lots of pests and diseases, which allows us to export our fruit, and that export market creates really high value. And that value is not really value that gets seen by the rest of the country. And so what we're really aiming to do is be producing high quality fruit, and we're doing that from the ground up. So there's sort of two elements. There's the below ground, I guess, soil physical and biological characteristics that I'll talk about, but then there's the above ground, or how does this actually translate to good wine or good fruit. So Pippa was doing a fabulous bit of work over the last 3 or 4 years working with Jantz. So Jantz is and many of you guys might have tasted their sparkling. They are really world famous for their sparkling, and they grow Pinot and they grow Chardonnay in the Coal River Valley, and just on the other side of Richmond. And they have a real, I guess I'd say, a biodynamic approach to wine grape growing. And they're super interested in working with us in this body of work. And Jen and now David Hansen, these guys I guess we work on these farms because these farmers are champions of the work that we do. So it's not just me or Pippa getting up talking about the work. It's when other growers come and have a chat with Jen or with David, they can talk about some of the work that's happening on their farm. And I guess it's another form of extension, really, that really promotes the outcomes of the work that we're doing. And so Pippa has spoken to David, and she's spoken to Jen, and they've come up with a design for a trial. And that's the other point, is that the work that we do has to be co-designed with the grower, because the grower really, I guess, drives the research. facilitates the research and actually implements the research essentially, because Pippa can't be on farm all the time. So it's really exciting to be working with these kind of guys who are really endorsing the work and also allowing us to do it really well. And so one of the issues that they had was too much vigour. And so too much vigour in the vineyard obviously takes away from growing a good quality wine, good quality fruit. And so one of the ways that they wanted to control their vigour, and this is probably something that you wouldn't normally think about, is to grow a cover crop. And that also promotes a bit of competition with the vine, so that the vine's not producing so much vegetative, I guess, growth. And so in that context also, there's the challenge of well, what's this going to take from a water perspective? What's this going to cost me? And so we wanted to ask those questions too. So Pippa did a whole bunch of research and she did a bunch of literature review. And I think what's important to know is that we can't answer every question, but we can set 3 or 4 questions that hopefully we can address through the next 3 or 4 years of research. And we're recognising that it takes a lot of time for when we start a cover crop or we start a soil amendment for us to actually see the outcome of that in the soil biology or the soil physical properties. And so that's, I guess, where Pippa's coming from. And so she's chatting with Jen, she's chatting with Dave, and she's come up with 3 different treatments. And one of those is a legume living mulch. So that's the idea that you're going to be growing a legume that's going to promote nitrogen in the soil, and that is going to also create a cover crop scenario underneath the vines. And then there's the next treatment, which was a legume and a grass. So the idea of that is to have something that's a little bit more deep rooting, and that deep rooting is going to hold onto the soil a bit better, hold onto the soil moisture a bit better. And also the evidence was that once a legume does start producing nitrogen, that grass can actually facilitate the uptake of that nitrogen by changing the soil profile, and that uptake gets taken up by the vines. And so there was some evidence on the mainland that was happening. And then she wanted to try just a bare soil, and that's sort of a standard grower's practice in the Coal River Valley. And that's really important for us to benchmark exactly what's going to happen under her treatments. And so she had 3 really important questions. And those questions were, how do living mulches affect soil organic carbon? And the soil organic carbon story is, we all understand that story as being super important for changing the soil structure and holding onto water and also sequestering carbon. And so also influences the resilience of soil structure and soil water storage infiltration. And then the next question is, what is the relative importance of living mulch dry matter? So, what's the influence of the living mulch that she's created from the cover crop on the next season's outcomes? And that's really, really important question. And then is it the actual varieties that we're growing from a cover crop perspective, or is it actual biomass that we're growing that's having the influence? So that was a critical question that people wanted to ask. And I think that's a really important from a grower perspective as well, and how they manage their cover crop in the soil and how they mow and how they actually sow from a cover crop perspective to make sure that they're getting enough biomass to actually have a difference. And so, she started this trial 3 years ago, and she's implemented that over the last 3 years. And she actually also implemented another trial which looked at just a standard fertiliser strategy to see where her legumes would fit in the context of nitrogen supply. So this grower was really wanting to head away from synthetic fertiliser inputs, and so the idea of having a legume there was really appealing. But then we still wanted to know, well, what is that nitrogen replacement value provided by the legumes, and what sort of role does that play to replace that I guess the fertigated nitrogen that the grower would normally put on? So there's a bit of sense checking there as well, which is really important. And so, off she went and she did this, and the last 3 years she's been harvesting fruit, she's been looking at soil health and doing a bunch of work there. So there's 3 key points, and I'll get to the data in a moment, but the key points I want to take away from this was that living mulches increase soil carbon. Oh, actually the other point to say is she did this on 2 soil types. So it just so happened that the grower had planted the vineyard the same, so they planted Chardonnay on a soda soil. So soda soil is like a duplex soil, so texture contrast soil with a sandy loam at the top and then a clay underneath. And then she also tried it in a dermazole, and that you'd normally call that in Tassie, or particularly in Richmond, a black cracking clay. And it really is a black cracking clay, where it was on sort of on the top of a hill, and that clay, once it gets dry, it really does crack and has some great big gaps in it. And so the point was to look at, well, does soil type matter as well on the influence of the cover crops? So let's just quickly turn the page and I'll show you some of the data. So, I mean, one of the things that you've got to think about when you're planting cover crops is the function of that cover crop as well. And so Pippa was really cautious about making sure she chose cover crops that the grower was happy to work with. And so they had low growth habit, so didn't require any mowing over the summer period, and also summer dormancy, so that they weren't super competitive as well. The other issue is of course making sure that you've got a weed. You're always going to have weeds come up. So it was really important for her to manage those weeds that come up as well, to make sure that those treatments actually made sense. So then what are the outcomes? So the first outcome was that total organic carbon increased on the Dermazole. And so this is after only 3 years worth of work, and I think it was a really interesting result to see that organic carbon increased in the Dermazole. We did not see that in the Sodasol. We can kind of understand that, right? So on the Sodasol, you do see a lot of leaching quite quickly. The water moves through that sandy loam profile quite quickly, and it's not so surprising that we might lose some of the carbon that we've been accumulating. Whereas the Dermazole was quite happy to hold it. And we certainly saw that the quantities of current season living mulch were correlated with increasing soil organic carbon in the Dermazole. Go for it.
So what depth was that?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, exactly. So that was measured about between 10 to 15 centimetres. So the assumption is in that period of time, we're not going to see anything below 40 centimetres. We want to get it down to 40 centimetres, no doubt, but in the context of being able to measure things quickly, efficiently, and make sure we get enough data for Pippa to publish, we looked at the 10 to 15 soil layer. But it's a really good point. And so that was the outcome, and it wasn't necessarily associated with treatment, but it certainly was associated with biomass. Then the next one was resilience of soil structure was improved, and this is really critical, right? Because we always talk about the word soil health, but there's not often a good way of understanding what soil health looks like and what soil health means. And we've tried to characterise it in 3 different ways. We are looking at, I guess, benchmarks for soil physical properties, and I'll get to those in a moment, soil biological properties, and then soil chemical properties. So biological properties is that we can demonstrate an increasing amount of mycorrhizal of fungi or soil bacteria, and also the ratio of fungi to bacteria, and targeting a particular type of soil biology for our orchards or vineyards. And so, we are looking for a fungi-dominated system, and we are looking for mycorrhizal fungi that do serve a function. So a function in the ability to break down phosphorus and make that available to the vines or the trees. And so Pippa's focus was really on the soil physical properties and also the soil chemical properties, because there's a cost. We all know there's a cost to soil biological analysis, but we can't look at those things in isolation. We know that there's a link between the 3 of them. Anyway, so the resilience of soil structure was improved. So we used water stable aggregate, so aggregate stability as one of our measures. And so we can do that. We've got a soil physics lab at the university, and we can look at aggregate stability. And so what we found was that on both soils, more living mulch, dry matter resulted in more water stable aggregates. And so I'd say that you could use the word sort of porosity. So it improved soil porosity in that sort of scenario. But on the Dermazole, the dry matter from the previous season had the strongest effect. So we saw a greater effect this time on the Dermazole, again, instead of the Sodasol. But I think it was important to note that on the Dermazole, the dry matter from the previous season had the strongest effect, whereas the Sodasol, we required the cumulative effect from 1 year on top of the next year. And that's what Pippa's finding, and that's why we have to do these analysis year on year on year, because it's the cumulative effect that we're looking for to see what the outcome is. And I guess the point is, we need to be able to, or we can say we have improved soil health, but unless we actually show some of the science behind it, we're not going to be able to convince a grower to adopt a certain strategy. And that's we can't just have anecdotal evidence that it looked better, or that the cover crops looked better, or that the vines look better. We actually need to show some of the science. And so whilst you can't look at every single measure, you can look at some that are going to be, I guess, indicators of improved soil health. And certainly aggregate stability is one of them. And then finally, water infiltration and storage were not significantly affected. So we couldn't actually change how much water the soil held. And, I mean, it is a critical factor, particularly in Richmond. And if you guys know the Richmond area, it gets about 300 to 350 mils annually, as opposed to the 1,000 or 1,200 mils we get down here in the Huon Valley, if not more. And so water's critical. How a grower uses water, how a soil stores water is really critical for those wine grape growers. But at the same time, it also gives you more control, right? So all these guys are drip irrigating, and these guys have often are linked in with the water schemes, but that water is expensive. And so water in that part of the world does matter, and yet we're only sort of 50 k's away from the Coal River Valley, and water here is essentially free. So those kind of things really do matter, but it also influences the grape and wine quality as well. So what we did find that the increase in water-stable aggregates in the presence of living mulches will make pores less susceptible to degradation. So I think that's another really important point. We're going to need more time, I think, to really be changing the amount of water that the soil can hold. But we do know that even in the short term that Pippa's been doing this work, we've been able to see that degradation is going to slow down, and that's really important. And so I think from a grower perspective, there are a few key take-home messages, and they are to increase soil organic carbon and soil structural resilience. Growers should prioritise the biomass of your cover crop as opposed to a particular species. So I think that for me still raises the question, and that is understanding the function of a legume cover crop as opposed to, say, a legume grass. And we, the grower had its purpose is to try and use legumes as a nitrogen replacement. And what we did find when we plotted we actually used yan, so yeast assimilable nitrogen in the fruit. So yan's a really important plays a really important process in the winemaking process in that the proteins from the yan facilitate the fermentation process. And so when we looked at yan, we can see that from a fertigation perspective, the more nitrogen we put on, the more yan is in the fruit. And that makes total sense, we get that. So we wanted to see, well, how much nitrogen did the legumes provide and where did that fit in that curve? And what we found is that I think it equaled about 20 units a hectare of nitrogen that got applied to the fertigation system. And so that is also influenced by the biomass of the legume at the time. But we also want to know, when does that nitrogen become available? And is that aligned with when the vine's actually going to take it up? And that's really important. And that question still remains unanswered. But we have a strategy to actually answer that question, because one of the ways we can do that is looking at a labelled nitrogen. So it's a different stable isotope of nitrogen, or different isotope of nitrogen, that allows us to track the movement of that isotope up into the vine based on where it's come from. So if we've labelled a legume with 15N, that legume then sort of does its thing in the soil and then makes nitrogen available. We can track the movement of nitrogen made available from the legume up into the vine when that actually happens. And hopefully we'll get a quantity then, and hopefully we'll also get a timing. And we want to make sure that the timing is aligned with when the vine actually takes it up. And so, a grower is also really conscious about when a vine takes up nitrogen, because that's going to influence fruit quality. And so, obviously, the grower wants to build a canopy really quick, so there's lots of photosynthesis happening, but we don't want it to happen too late in the season, because that could influence ripening. And having too much nitrogen in the fruit could also extend the timing of ripening, so that you can't harvest fruit at the right time, but also can keep going with vegetative growth rather than actually producing fruit. So there's a few the final take-home message there is living mulches are unlikely to improve water filtration in the short term. And so we need more time to be doing this with the grower. And in fact, we've just applied for another grant to keep this project going for the next 3 to 4 years, so that we can really look at the long-term consequences of our cover crop treatments. So that's the wine story. Pippa hasn't made wine from this fruit yet, and I'm hoping that in this final year she will make wine, and we'll be able to tell the story of wine quality under cover crops. And it's not something that hasn't been done before, but certainly Pippa's strategy for cover crop planting hasn't been done before, and it'd be great to see what the wine tastes like and looks like, and even consumer preference to see what it's like at the end of her work. So that's the vine story. The apple story is slightly different, and that's because we've come on a long journey with apple growers for trying to get them to understand the idea of healthy soil in an orchard system, because most growers tend to want to have a neat orchard. They want to have not that much weed strip. They want to have a bare strip underneath the trees because water is a really big deal. And so we're really working with growers to grasp the idea of having their orchards a bit messier, having a bit more biodiversity under the soil, and understand the difference in function between a tree line that's covered in I guess weed strip or green grass or cover crops versus the interrow, which also serves the purpose as well when that's covered too. So there's two functions going on here. One is obviously soil health, but the other is promoting an environment that can attract insects, predatory insects, that can serve as pollinators or can serve as mitigating the risks of codling moth or light brown apple moth or deal with mites. And so things like predatory insects like codling, Mastris or a bunch of others that sit there quite happily when you've got a cover crop system in place. So we've come on a long journey with apple growers looking at soils. We started off looking at how much nitrogen an apple tree needed from a fertigation perspective, and we looked at, we applied nitrogen through a fertigation system using this 15N process. We excavated trees, we looked at when nitrogen got taken up into the tree, exactly how much a tree required when they were producing 60 to 80 tonne a hectare, and then really tried to understand when do we need to be applying that nitrogen to make sure that tree uses it really efficiently so that we can use it less. And then make recommendations to the grower about how to really apply a fertigation system that was highly efficient. So a lot of growers would just have an attitude that, well, nitrogen, because it's cheap, we'll just put a lot on, and it acts like it's like an insurance mechanism. If we've got a lot on, we know the apple tree is either going to choose or not to take it up, and there's no real impact. But we actually were able to show that the more nitrogen you put on, it actually did have a negative impact on fruit quality. It delayed ripening, we had softer fruit, and it didn't store as well. And so once we were able to make recommendations on how an apple tree used nitrogen, we're able to say to growers, well, how about we set up a system that applies nitrogen just slowly drip fed through the system at the end of your irrigation cycle. And that allowed a grower to really drop their nitrogen requirements from 100 units a hectare to 30 or 40 units a hectare. So now, in the context of higher nitrogen prices, it actually does make a difference. So it's a huge saving for the grower, but it's also really important from a nitrous oxide emissions perspective too. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas emission, and we're able to demonstrate that this approach to fertigation was really environmentally conscious as well. But then growers wanted to take it to the next step. Well, we actually want to reduce our nitrogen requirements. We wanted to use alternative sources of nitrogen. How are we going to do that? And so this is where our cover crop story comes into it. And the idea that we're going to grow legumes and grasses under the cover crop, create a mixed diversity of species to attract pollinators and attract beneficial insects was something that the growers really wanted to do. And so the funding that comes from this comes from growers' levies. So growers, whenever they produce fruit, a portion of those dollars goes to research or goes to Horticulture, which is our national research, corporate research centre. And then they leverage those dollars with the federal government and they put out projects for tender. And then institutes from across the country can apply for those projects and do a bunch of work. And so the apple industry said, well, we want to look at two things. We want to look at soil health and we want to look at cover crops. And we also want to look at the IPDM impact, so the integrated pest and disease management impact of what we do to manage the orchard floor. So we took a real overarching orchard floor management approach, and we work with growers across the country in each of the main growing regions, and we ask really important, locally important questions on cover crops and orchard floor management and compost and hydro-seeding and other bits and pieces that growers could possibly take on as a way of managing their orchards. And I remember when we started this project, we did an extension exercise where we asked growers, who considers the impact of your orchard floor management? And it was actually deathly silent. So there was actually no grower that put up their hand and said, yeah, we think about soil health as a consequence of the way that we manage our orchard floor. But at the end of this, 3 or 4 years later, growers were able to go, yes, actually we now know that there's an impact to what we do, and the orchard floor actually matters. And so that was a really exciting outcome. So our research questions there were, how do living and organic mulches in the tree line affect soil physical properties, soil biological properties and soil chemical properties? And we spent a whole bunch of time looking at the full gamut of properties underneath the soil. And we started from early on as a benchmark before we applied the treatments, and we've gone now into our 4th year and we've looked at soil physical properties, soil chemical and biological. And we're in the process now of getting our soil biological data. And so we have set trials up in the Huon Valley here, and we're working with Matthew Tack. Many of you guys might know Matthew. We're working with Andrew Smith. So Andrew Smith runs Willie Smith's. It's the organic orchard on the way down into the Huon. And we also set this up in growers' farms across the country too, with on the Adelaide Hills, the Manjimup area, and also the Orange and the Batlow area in New South Wales. And we're working with growers who are champions of this work, who want to do this, who want to see the outcomes and the potential benefits of cover crops. And so I won't go into the details too much of what we actually applied, because that's all in the fact sheet here, and you can get hold of that and read that in more detail. But I want to take you to some of the outcomes, because that's really, really, really important. Just quickly, what makes an orchard system sustainable? I mean, sustainability is our long-term outcome, but the context is that it has to be profitable as well. Yeah. And so pollination obviously is a direct service, biological pest and disease regulation, weed suppression, nutrient cycling are just some. But then there's a broader service, and that is carbon storage. And there's so much conversation now about carbon sequestration and keeping carbon into the soil. Regulation of soil and water quality. So when we have rich mycorrhizal and diverse communities, we know that we're improving our soil and water quality, as well as our ability to access nutrients that an apple tree wouldn't normally be able to do. And then genetic diversity is critical as well. So not only genetic diversity of our trees or of our living mulches, but also of the pests and our insect ecology too. So there's outcomes. We wanted to see that apple growers could resource and understand how to use their water and nitrogen resources sustainably and efficiently, that they had strategies to be able to, that they understood in the way that they manage their orchard floor, and that we ended up with a long-term and resilient apple growing system so that us consumers can eat apples in the future, and with improved environmental footprints. So we set up these trials in the Huon, and we're working with Andrew Smith. And I'll just go to the last page there, where there's the charts. So that's the Pips for Profit Southern Bliss first season results. So I just want to say that those, when I say first season, so it's the first season of Pips 4, but that comes from 3 years worth of work in this orchard. And these are relatively young trees. And one of the best signs that we're onto the right thing is when a grower comes into the orchard and goes, I can actually see the difference in trees associated with these treatments. And that's what Andrew Smith could do. And so if Andrew's saying to us that he's happy with what we're doing and he can see that there's an outcome just purely by looking at the apples and the trees, well, that's a really great testimony to the work that we're doing. So we applied compost, we applied pea straw, we applied his normal strategy of mow and throw, and then he also, and then there's another strategy of just untreated to make sure that there's a control mechanism. And that untreated is a bare strip that he's managing. And so, and generally that's going to be, I guess, the clumping grass, the real typical clumping grass that you see around here. It is highly competitive as well. So if you look at fruit yield, so this has to have an outcome on fruit quality, right? So fruit yield. So we were able to see that the compost, straw and mow and throw had a significant impact on fruit yield compared to the treated. It was the same with fruit number per tree. It was the same with not so much fruit weight, but also with the DA index. And DA index is a measure of maturity as well, and harvest index. And so these, I mean, what we didn't see was obviously differences between the treatment, which helped us to understand that it doesn't really necessarily matter what we're actually applying at the time. And we were applying, say, 10 centimetres of compost, and that's from a locally sourced supplier, so Cherries Tasmania. And we were applying straw from a locally sourced straw place, and then mowing and throwing. So rather than, I guess, the grower just leaving their clippings on the orchard floor, they would throw them into the tree line. And that's not an unusual strategy, but we wanted to see the impact of that compared to compost. And I think the evidence suggests that we're on the right track, and we're going to keep looking at these treatments over the next few years. I just want to take you back a page to some of the final outcomes from what we found from across the country. And I think I'll just find. So if you find this key messages page here, what I want to talk about is that soil improvement is a long-term process and investment, and so part of this process is also looking at the cost, the benefit-cost ratio of these treatments. So if a grower is just going to do their normal tree line management, how does actually adding compost impact their bottom line, and how are we actually going to see the profitability of these orchard floor management treatments? So we are collecting the time on what it costs to actually purchase the materials, to spread them, what kind of capital costs you require to actually have a compost spreader or a mower and a thrower, and looking at that from a profitability perspective. So there was general trend for the improved soil indicators under living grass, clover mulches, compost and organic mulches. Again, we didn't really see much difference in the type of material that we're looking at, as long as we actually had something there. There was limited influence on fruit quality to start off with, but we certainly found that fruit firmness and yield, particularly in the young trees, were affected by our treatments. We tried native species as well. Native species proved completely unsuitable, and mostly because we're already working in a high nutrient environment. Whether you're an organic orchard or whether you're a conventional orchard, there's so much phosphorus that sort of sits there, and so much nitrogen that sits there, that natives just don't cope with the germination process, but also don't cope with establishment as well. So we tried seed spreading native species. We also tried tube stock, and they just did not take to a functional way. Herbaceous meadow plants. So we tried a bunch of herbaceous species as well through the interrow, and that was to really try and create a flowering meadow mix to provide a resource for alternative pollinators. And we certainly found that they would persist, or that they would be there, but we'd lose them at the end of the season, and that depended on how a grower managed their mowing strategies as well. So not only do we come up with a set of strategies for cover crops, but also how they actually got to manage their mowing and their if they've got an orchardist and they've got a tractor driver, they're not necessarily going to appreciate the strategies for why a grower's going to do something. So we do really need to communicate this across the line, from the manager right through to the other orchard staff, to make sure that they're on the same page with what we're trying to do. And future research is going to be looking at strategies. So it is going to be looking at compost. It is going to be looking at the undervine mulches, which provide the greatest economic and benefits to growers. Look, this is just a really short snapshot. There's a bunch of data in here, and I'm happy to keep chatting to you about this. And I think, overarching, we want to be working with growers who want to see take a long-term view to apple growing. And hopefully this is just a real short little snippet to help getting growers to understand that. Any questions at all on this?
Thank you, Nigel. That's fantastic. Questions-wise, are you happy to repeat that question?
Yeah, sure.
So it comes on there.
So the key here is to increase biodiversity in the growing system. Are you going to start researching by adding extra biodiversity, as in livestock stuff?
Yeah, so the question was biodiversity in the system, and what some of the strategies that we could be looking at to increase biodiversity in the system. Look, in a commercial orchard scenario, I would say no, we're not going to be looking at that. That's not to say that there wouldn't be benefits at all. There are certainly risks with having livestock in the system, and I think if a grower had seen the benefit for doing that, they probably would be doing it already. That's not to say that I'd be really keen to look at sheep grazing in the system at particular times, and also some bigger livestock as well. But that's not part of our research question at the moment. The biodiversity question really is about insect ecology and plant ecology at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question sort of following from that. But with Pippa's research, if you're planting under vine, you've got grasses and you cover, what are your management strategies for that? Are you, if you're not running sheep or anything,
Yeah.
are you coming in and slashing that? And how does that affect like the biomass amounts and stuff?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The question is there, if we're growing cover crops, if we're growing grasses or legumes under the vine, how does a grower manage their mowing strategy if you don't have grazing animals? So there's a number of different ways that they're doing it, and they're looking at different slashing strategies and timing of slashing. And so growers now have got these they're fairly little machines that essentially act as whippersnippers. So rather than actually slashing the grass, it just knocks the grass over, and that seems to be enough to keep the competition at bay. And so the challenge they've got is to understand when they've got to do that. So it's a balance between, because some of the guys just really want their vineyards neat, and there's an ecotourism aspect to that as well. But some of the growers just really want a neat system, and so they'll keep their grasses mowed. But we're encouraging growers to even 1 month of the year we have a strategy which is no mow November or no mow October, and they're doing that in the Northern Hemisphere. They had a no mow May, right? And so that's sort of thing that we're encouraging, just for 1 month, just to leave it, and that might be enough time for seeds to set or for flowers to flower, so that the bees might be have some more encouraging, diversity to come into the orchard.
I was considering mowing every second row, for example, and leaving one for pollination and for flowering for insects, and they're taking the other out, which might help with the ecotourism if people, as a secondary benefit, because you got that neat thing, but if people ask, they can say, well, that's part of the whole system that we're doing to support the biodiversity of the place.
Yeah, exactly. So the question was, could a grower actually leave one row and then mow the next row? We actually want to take it to a step further, and growers we're experimenting now with hedge rows at the end of the row or on the sides of the row. So the idea is that we want to create a refuge for beneficial insects, beneficial ecology, and so I don't think a grower is going to leave one row and then not do it and then mow the next, because I think that's just not going to align with their efficiency strategies. But if we can actually create a hedgerow on one side, and we're experimenting with a bunch of different native species and exotic species together in a hedgerow to create have flowers that flower all throughout the year, I think that's going to be much more beneficial. And as long as a grower's got space for that, and are willing to leave some space and manage that from a tractor movement perspective, I think we're going to see real benefits there. And so we want to test the benefit of that by looking at insect traps from the outside of the orchard right through to the middle of the orchard and see how far the insects move. Yeah, question there.
What types of native species were trialled? Was it just grasses?
Yep, it was definitely a bunch of local native grasses. In Western Australia, we tried Canedia and we've tried Myoporum, and they seem to be the two best. From a hedgerow perspective, we're going to be trying Leptospermum and a bunch of I can't remember the species offhand. I think the species list might be in there, but we do have a species list that we did trial that I can access. But we just did not. One, it was expensive. The tube stock was really expensive, and we just did not have establishment success. Question there.
Is there any talk of like value adding in winter, other crops that to put in between the rows?
Yeah. Look, it's fine. I have conversation. So the question was there: could you value add by having other crops in the interrow? And the answer to that question is no. we're here to grow apples, or we're here to grow, and we're good at apple growing, and we're not good at growing a vegetable. We're not good at growing that sort of thing. That's not to say that's a dismissive response. It is because during that time of the year, from a labour management perspective, they're pruning. They've got to actually have tractor movements inside the row, and it's actually not something that's really functional for them to be able to do that. Most of the guys will grow like a pea crop or something like that, a legume crop in the interrow over the winter period, but not to make money. Question here.
So are you putting a biological component into the testing regime to see where that's going? If it is fungal dominant, is it?
Yeah, look, I haven't spoken about the biology results yet because we haven't. Oh, sorry. The question was, what's the biological outcomes of the work that we're doing? We are doing that work, but we have another PhD student who's commenced to address that, and we haven't got there yet. Haven't got the data for that yet. Any more questions? Yeah, question.
Just with the legumes and the nitrogen to apply, is there a certain time of year that they release the nitrogen, or do you have to kill the legume for them to release it?
Yep. Well, that's both answers are right. So yes, they do release nitrogen at a certain time of the year, and you do have to knock the legume down for that process to start happening. And the evidence suggests that legume does release nitrogen more in the warmer parts of the year, so in the summer period, as the legume itself gets stressed or as that legume dies. The big challenge we've got is that we decide to grow a legume, but we're not actually sure if it's nodulating. And so we have to be really clear or really careful to make sure that we could be growing legume, make sure it's happy, but we have to make sure that it's actually nodulating in a way that there's nitrogen being stored and nitrogen that can be released once those the legumes start to decompose. And so, like I said before, the timing of nitrogen release is critical. So if the nitrogen gets released later on in the season, but the apple or vines need that nitrogen early in November, there's a mismatch of timing, and we're going to see what we're actually wanting to grow go hungry.
And so is that more before it flowers, or is there like a life cycle to the?
There is absolutely a life cycle to the legume. Yeah, but it's going to vary in the system that it's been grown in. Yes.
I have a question about what you might call an old-fashioned cider orchard.
Sure.
My daughter and her partner have just planted a cider orchard that they're determined is going to be oldie worldy, and don't want to listen to me. But they're growing diverse species underneath, but they're challenged by sort of saying, well, how tall do we let the grass grow? How tall do we allow the sunflowers to grow? When should we mow? Should we be mowing the row or the interrow? And all of those questions. Are there resources available currently that you could direct us to answer those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, look, height of grass underneath the canopy is a big deal, and it harbours pests and harbours diseases, no doubt about that. It's also an airflow impact, and that has a real big impact on plant pathology as well. And so we would generally, most growers are not comfortable to have have grasses come this high. Sunflower's different, right? That's a very different species, and the purpose of sunflowers is obviously to get that the flowers into the orchard to create that environment for alternative pollinators and for pollination, and of course, but certainly you are at a risk for outcompeting your established apple trees if you've got high grasses around that. And you might have to wait a couple of years before you bring, grasses too close to your growing stems. I mean, if a canopy, and this is the challenge, right? It's not necessarily that you have to make some sacrifices. You might have to sacrifice a bit of soil health at the start to get your trees up out of the ground and have your canopy structure. And so this is something that a grower always has to consider when it comes to the purpose of what they're doing.
Well, I think at the moment they've got like 5 metre spacing, so they're mulching around the tree and then allowing the non-mulch area to grow.
Sure. So the question is how to establish a young orchard, whether that's cider varieties or whether that's a traditional apple variety. And certainly a compost and mulch around the trees is great, but there's always going to be a compromise too there on nitrogen getting locked up and not being necessarily available to the tree, depending on how decomposed that compost is in the first place. Mm.
So is similar work being done on blueberries?
No, not to my knowledge. I would say that blueberries increasingly are going to be potted, and so they are going to be more of a hydroponic system in the future. And so there's a much different strategy to be managing that. But there's existing blueberry orchards around the place, no doubt about that. But I'm not aware of cover crop or fertigation research that's looked at that. I'm sure probably on the mainland or overseas it has been. We certainly haven't done that yet here in Tassie.
What about mowing versus crimping then?
Yeah, we have great conversations with Matt Tack, who's got a crimper, and Matt will say both are required. Absolutely both are required. Matt will crimp early on in the season, but he'll mow later on in the season. Right. So yeah, and it's totally seasonal, a seasonal strategy.
So what's the difference? So why is this crimping?
So crimping just lays it down. Essentially, it doesn't kill it. It doesn't knock the material off the actual plant. So it will keep on growing. And so Matt will make a decision on that depending on how thick material he wants in his interrow or his tree line. Whereas if he particularly later on in the season, when he's got his fruit growing, he's not wanting competition from these crops, he'll mow, right? But early on in the season, he'll probably crimp. Or later on, afterwards, once the fruits come off the tree, he'll probably start crimping again. But you've got to have a crimper, right? And that's another expensive toolkit. Yeah. I know this is there's a real interesting question there around what's the impact of compost or your treatments on fruit furteners from one season to the next. And look, I think the answer to that question has probably got to do with nitrogen availability from the compost. And every year compost changes, no doubt about that. We know that, and even though the compost provider tries to keep it similar, the same all the time, I'd say that perhaps in that season there was a whole state more nitrogen available, and that extra nitrogen was responsible for softer fruit. Yep. That's Nick. Yep.
Thank you.
No worries.